Justin Trudeau has set up a new department of the CBC called Kids News. It's the strangest thing. It's political commentary written by adults, but read by child actors targeting your children. There are a few stories that are not political, but almost every single story has a little leftist acorn in it to be planted in your child's mind. Sometimes it's shockingly obvious, sometimes it's more subtle, but it's always weird. And the whole thing is set up as a trick. It pretends to be kids talking to kids, but child actors as young as 10 years old, they don't write their own lines, they don't follow the news, they don't make the journalistic decisions of the state broadcaster, they don't make production decisions or story decisions. A 10-year-old is still learning times tables and spelling. Well, actually, come to think of it, they're probably not learning times tables and spelling. They're probably learning about gender, sex ed. I'm not kidding. One of the stories these kids were talking about to other kids was how mean Ontario Premier Doug Ford is for scrapping the child sex curriculum. Here's CBC Kids interviewing Jasmine, who just happened to be at a rally in support of this extreme sex ed, and she knew her lines.
There's not only just two genders. There are people that they don't really feel like who they really are, and they just want to be somebody else, and you have to respect that.
So that's Jasmine. She's 11. Now the CBC has a policy not to put minor children on TV without following a lot of rules, as in their parents have to approve. So who is Jasmine? Who are her parents? What's her last name? Who wrote that comment for her? Was she really a protester? Or is she working for the CBC, or both? Is her parent with the CBC? Was she really at this rally naturally and just happened to meet the CBC Kids News team there? Or did they pre-arrange to have her there and say her perfectly scripted lines straight out of the Liberal Party's transgender politics playbook? I mean, have you ever seen a real 11-year-old speak that way? This is for real. It's really on a special CBC site called CBC Kids News. This is not a parody. But was that even news, what you just saw there? Or was that opinion? But does an 11-year-old really have an opinion about transgenderism? Or are they just parroting their parents' opinions or a CBC producer's opinions? Was that Jasmine an actor? Well, we don't know. And neither does your child, the targeted recipient of this opinion. And before you ask, I watched the whole video. No, they did not have any children, giving the other point of view that maybe an 11-year-old is too young to talk about transgenderism and transsexualism and other extreme sex ed issues. No, this isn't news you're watching. This is propaganda. Have you ever heard of a state broadcaster promoting the government's agenda through children's programming before? Well, now you have. I've heard of it once before, but it was in the former Soviet Union. They had a hero called Pavlik Morozov, who became a hero in the Soviet Union because he turned in his own parents for speaking against Joseph Stalin's communist policies. Pavlik Morozov was given the title Informant Number One. He was made a hero that all Soviet children were told to emulate, that the highest honor was listening to the state instead of your own parents, and you had to turn in your own parents if necessary. But other than that, have you ever heard of a state broadcaster designing a propaganda show for young children? I'm not cherry picking here. It's in all of it. Here's a clip from another teen talking about how excited he is about Justin Trudeau's marijuana legislation.
Some people just think of getting high as an equivalent to having a glass of wine.
Hey, fellow kids, have you ever had a sip of wine? Maybe mom or dad let you have a sip of wine, or maybe you've seen a sip of wine at a restaurant. Well, smoking marijuana is just like that, kids. And I wouldn't lie to you because I myself am a kid, and not just a kid, I'm a kid with the government, so you can trust me. Don't listen to your parents if they're all bossy about it. Marijuana is just like wine, kids. And of course, what child doesn't talk like this?
And you see, legalizing marijuana would mean that there's lots of new businesses, giving the Canadian government an opportunity to make a lot of money by taxing marijuana products.
Yeah, that's exactly how kids who are even too young to have a driver's license talk. Well, you see, marijuana is good for economic development. You know, this sort of thing is it's a joke. It's a great joke. Here's my favorite version of this joke as told on the comedy show 30 Rock.
I was part of a special task force of very young-looking cops who infiltrated high schools. How do you do, fellow kids?
What?
Now that's the joke version of it, and that's funny, but that's what the CBC is doing here, and doing in all seriousness. Instead of having some lame adult trying to be cool, they just pay child actors to say the same thing. So it really is fellow kids. But do you really think these kids wrote a word of this themselves? Don't be absurd. Now the CBC lies about it, of course. Here's a page on their website called Meet the CBC Kids News Team. Real kids, real news. We also know that kids want to hear from other kids. That's why we've spent the last few months working with an editorial board made up of 4 kids, just like you, from across the country. They're the ones in the video at the top of the page. They help us decide what kids want to know about, what kids have questions about, and what kids are talking about. We're also developing a team of kid contributors who are our eyes and ears on the ground. Hang on, do you think those kids are a real editorial board? I was on the editorial board of the National Post for 2 years. Every morning we would meet and pitch stories, and then our editor would confirm our assignments, and we would do the research and the writing, and we would come back, and our story would be edited, and then it would be published. Sometimes our name was on our own work, sometimes we wrote unsigned editorials, but we were the keepers of the editorial flame of the newspaper. We had different beats. I covered federal politics and foreign affairs, things like that. Do you think that's what happens here? Do you think that these children meet every day and decide what they're working on today, what's the breaking news today, and do the research and the writing and make any decisions at all? Do you think they're the deciders here? I mean, do you really think so? Let me help you. They're not. They're actors. In fact, their biographies, 3 out of the 4 stars they have are literally actors. That's what their CBC biographies say. They are child actors hired to sell the propaganda written for them by the liberal extremists who do the actual story selection and actual research and actual writing. And we're not told who they are, because that's the thing about propaganda. It doesn't really work to have a kid's propaganda show if you can see the adult's hand making the child's puppet move its mouth. One of the child actors is from Toronto. His name is Ari Resnick. Who's he? Well, it's irrelevant who he is because he's nothing but a front. More interesting would be who are his parents. Do you know any 10-year-old who has political views different from their parents? I mean, 10-year-olds really don't have political views at all. So if they do, like pro-transgender Jasmine there, it's obvious they're just being a prop for their parents or just parroting what they hear. But you can't know that, and you can't really find out, can you? You can't Google a 10-year-old. 10-year-olds aren't even supposed to have a trail on social media. They're too young to have a Facebook account or a Twitter account or a YouTube account. It's actually against the terms of service of those companies to let children of tender years on the internet. It would be really creepy. So they're obviously minor children being animated by someone else, but you can't know who. It really feels like one of those gross, you know those slightly creepy beauty pageants for prepubescent girls that are really dolled up with too much adult makeup. They're too young, and they're so obviously just serving as avatars for their parents. I think the CBC News Kids thing is a left-wing version of that. Let me show you a video done by this 10-year-old I mentioned, Ari Resnick, who is on their editorial board. Yeah, 10-year-olds on their editorial board. And I'm the king of Spain, people. Watch this. It starts off talking about Little League baseball. Now that sounds like something fun for a 10-year-old. Yeah, well, you can get sports anywhere. No need for that on the state broadcaster's child propaganda wing. No, this is about a teachable moment, you see, about the evil Donald Trump and his war against refugees. I kid you not, Ari Resnick, this 10-year-old child actor, was told to read someone's propaganda lines about a baseball game, and then he suddenly became the voice of the anti-Trump resistance. Take a look at this.
Let me explain. The team's star player, Dio Gamma, almost didn't get to play at all because of immigration issues. His parents are Mexican, but he was born in the United States. For the last few years, Gamma's family has been trying to get refugee status in Canada. But the application is under review, which means Gamma is not supposed to travel. That would have meant missing out on the championships. But Team Canada rallied around Gamma. In the end, the Canadian government gave him a temporary visitor permit so he could play.
Yeah, that's propaganda. That's super gross. It's gross of Ari Resnick's parents for turning him into a little Occupy Wall Street freak like that. It's gross of the CBC to target your kids with that. It's gross that you and I have to pay for this through our taxes. The whole thing is really creepy. Almost every story, right now things are pretty tense between Justin Trudeau and the Aboriginal community. I don't know if you know this, but just the other day, Trudeau visited with a group of First Nations chiefs in Saskatchewan, some who had driven in for hours just to meet with him. And because he was late and because he wanted to get to his next photo op, he literally had only 10 minutes with them. And he told them that they had to say whatever they came to say in 30 seconds or less.
I would like to go around the table quickly, so everyone around the table can speak, but you can't speak for more than 30 seconds. Introduce yourself and give me your documents, because we missed, the time was mismanaged around here.
So that's the reality of Trudeau and Aboriginal people this week. But this week, here's the story that the CBC Kids put on their Kids Propaganda page after their Kids editorial board meeting. It was about a Moldie school and Aboriginal kids who came to protest on Parliament Hill. And here's what CBC Kids wrote. I'm just kidding, we don't know who wrote it. I'm guessing it wasn't 10-year-old Ari Resnick. I don't think any 10-year-old would say the words Indigenous Services Minister. Here, let me read. After the kids spoke, Jane Philpott, the Canadian politician in charge of making sure Indigenous people have access to the services they need, spoke to the crowd. The Indigenous Services Minister said she would work with community members to make sure that you have the very best possible school to go to. I'm serious. The CBC Propaganda Network wrote this, and then they broadcast a very short clip of that Liberal cabinet minister, but it sounds like it was cut short when the kids started to heckle her. This is the full clip.
To make sure that you have the very best possible school to go to. I know that we have temporary arrangements for this year, and we're going to work on even better arrangements as soon as possible.
So just like that child sex curriculum story, they only had one side of the debate here, the Liberal side. Of course there were no opposition MPs. That would be too confusing for a 10-year-old. Six genders isn't too confusing, but actually quoting an opposition MP or quoting an Aboriginal leader saying the Liberals are all talk and no action, why, that would be too much conflict for a 10-year-old. Look, it would be too much conflict for a 10-year-old. None of this belongs in the world of a 10-year-old. This is all grown-up stuff, but it's being designed to radicalize and propagandize your children. It's really creepy. One last example, but I could use just about every single example on this CBC Kids website. This is a story called What Happened on This Day? No, not 9/11, which we just marked. Not a day like that. Are you crazy? Not a historical day, not a day of Canadian national importance or anything like that. They were marking the 7th anniversary of the Occupy Wall Street protests. Now that's a US-based gimmick, a professional protest funded by George Soros to attack the US capitalist system after the banks failed and were bailed out almost a decade ago. We had some copycat Occupy Wall Street shantytowns up here in Canada, but it never really took off since our Canadian banks, didn't fail. And so they weren't bailed out. We actually got through that 2008 recession better than any other G7 country. So this isn't even a thing. And it's not a Canadian thing. And it's not a kids thing. Occupy Wall Street was adults, and it was gross. It often turned into violence, serious riots, as well as lots of sexual assaults and drug crimes at the shantytowns. But to the CBC, this is worth commemorating as a great historic event to teach your children what days to mark. Here, let me quote from the propaganda site. On this day in 2011, the Occupy Wall Street movement was started by mostly young people to protest income inequality worldwide. What is its slogan? Hang on, is that really what it was about? To protest income inequality? No, it wasn't. It was anti-capitalist. It was socialist. And can you really call it by mostly young people when it was funded by a professional leftist in his 70s at the time? I don't think so. And then they have a poll to teach you the motto of this left-wing group. They have a quiz, and then they tell you if you're right or wrong. Say, do you think they're going to have a follow-up to this to show what happens in Venezuela under Occupy Wall Street-style socialism? I mean, since they're into foreign news. Do you think they'll mark any protests on the right, such as the peaceful, law-abiding March for Life rally in Ottawa each year? Don't make me laugh. I mean, I'm sure their editorial board, those 4 child actors, ages 10 to 15, I'm sure when they meet on their conference call and when they call the meeting to order, it will be on their agenda. What a joke this whole thing is. But the bigger joke is that there are thousands of journalists who have been laid off in Canada in the past decade from every private sector media company. In fact, entire newspapers and magazines and radio stations and TV stations have shut down. Real journalists let go, some of them quite good. They're out of work. But the state broadcaster isn't hiring real journalists. There's no journalism at all on this webpage. A 10-year-old probably shouldn't even be taking the public bus by himself, let alone covering a crime story or a foreign policy story. This is not news. And it's not by kids. It's adult propaganda written by the embedded leftists at the CBC, read on screen by child actors. You'd think real journalists would be appalled by this. It's the definition of fake news. It's an insult to real journalists, but I haven't seen a single peep because journalists all know the only place that's actually hiring is Justin Trudeau's state broadcaster. And if you criticize him or them, you have no chance of getting work there. So maybe polish up your resume and send it in to their editorial board. Tell Ari that you're really good at taking Trudeau's campaign platform and making it kid-friendly and writing more scripts for your new bosses, the child actors, to read. That's the state of journalism in Canada. It's kids' propaganda, and everyone, including Andrew Scheer's Conservatives, they seem just fine with that. That's an excerpt from my daily show, the Ezra Levant Show, weekdays at 8 p.m. Eastern. Every day I do a monologue, interview a guest, and read my fan mail and my hate mail. To subscribe, go to therebel.media/shows.